we'll try and work out this cabling situation.
Okay. All right, I can hear all the crinkling.
My apologies for the sound. It'll be pretty.
Okay. That's all right. Just let me know when it's ready.
Thank you. It should auto-adjust. We may have to adjust the sync, but it should be fine. Okay, it's just you just need to change it to duplicate, I think. That'll work. And can you see that okay?
All right, I believe we have technology problem solved. You are on a big screen,
Yay.
looking at several people who are listening intently.
Okay.
So anytime you're ready, go ahead and
Okay.
start talking.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you guys for inviting me to speak today because, as a scientist, we get in our little academic bubble and not very often get to go out and talk to completely different groups of people about the stuff that we're working on, which is actually really important for our research in general. So this is a topic that, well, first of all, I'm a cognitive scientist, and my background is in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and I'm also a behavior therapist. And so this is a topic that I have been working on for about, I think, 4 years now, and it's my primary research interest, which I actually consider to be probably the most important thing that I've ever worked on. This is actually really important to me personally. It was kind of like a journey of self-exploration a bit. And so what I'm looking at is a personality type called Altruism, which stands for extreme altruism, or you could think of it as an extreme heroic behavior or a whistleblower personality. And so people that I see that embody this completely and perfectly as far as my model goes, someone like Edward Snowden, and also people like Aaron Swartz and other people that you're probably familiar with that you look up to as being patriots kind of in your field. The problem is that this type of behavior is similar in a lot of ways and often compared to sociopathy. And in some dimensions, they're actually very similar. And I actually sent along like an overview over email right before I got on here, kind of like just of a brief description of the personality type and what I'm going to be talking about. Because it is kind of a complicated topic, but I don't want to spend too much time on the details. I want to talk about more of the application of. So basically, an ex-altruist they're the person that they're willing to put themselves out there on the line, looking to stand with courage in the face of adversity, willingness to break rules and to the common good. They put the cause before themselves, and because of that, oftentimes they face getting fired from their job, getting imprisoned, arrested, or sometimes even killed just so that they can stand up for their mission. And so the problem, I'm looking at this kind of like from two angles. First of all, just what defines an ex-altruist. It's never been a cohort that's been actually defined specifically, so this is kind of a brand new thing. And since I first came out with this a couple of years ago, in a few essays that I wrote, one for Scientific American and one on my personal blog, I received a lot of attention from people that are studying similar things, and they're like, yes, you're really onto something, and this is really important. So I've continued on this line, and what ended up happening is a person that would maybe be perceived as a sociopath by their behaviors, their outward behaviors. We don't really consider all the time the motivation and intent of why people do things. And that's actually one of the critical things that separates someone who is a sociopath from someone who is an ex-altruist. The ex-altruist may end up breaking the law or even killing someone or doing extreme things that we may consider immoral, but in the context of why they're doing it, it's actually the moral choice, the right thing to do, just because of the context. And so as far as like good and bad and good and evil and things like that, these are all context driven. There is no one definition of morality or what it means to be good or what it means to be evil. And it doesn't mean that every time you follow the rules, you're doing the right thing, and every time you break the rules, you're doing the wrong thing. Sometimes it's exactly opposite. Sometimes following the rules is actually the wrong thing to do, and you have an obligation to break them in order to do the moral and ethic thing. So it's kind of like a sticky subject. And when I told people that I was actually speaking at this conference, one of the things that I heard from them was, well, you seem like the kind of person that's always about, following the rules all the time, so I'm kind of surprised that you would be taking this approach. And I'm actually not a thing. Sometimes the right thing did, I think it was necessary, and for him specifically, he had that absolute intolerance for seeing injustice happening and not doing anything about it. So, in his case, the government's after him, he's living in seclusion, but when he was asked, would you do this again? And he was like, absolutely, and he knows that he might be in jail forever. He knows that he might always be living in seclusion, and he's okay with that. He wouldn't change it, because for him it was worth it. He had a threshold for things that were wrong that he saw, and he acted. But one of the other angles I'm looking at is, so the ex-altruist has this tendency to go out on a limb and take bold action and courage in the face of adversity in order to, do things for the common good. But every time you put yourself out there and every time you stand up to potential punishment or death or things like that, there's always a chance of getting damaged in the process. And someone who lives this life on a daily basis, in any way, not just putting your life at risk, but people who, in your job, you stand up for what's right, even if it means getting reprimanded or fired, and you're constantly always stepping in to help out someone, even if you don't know them or like them, because it's just the right thing to do. You do this long enough, and eventually it could wear down on you, because while a lot of us consider these kinds of people heroes, we're not actually treated that way in society, which is sad. And so what ends up happening is you have, not only are you fighting against the status quo, but then you have the people that are trying to maintain the status quo trying to drag you down as well. And it gets exhausting and emotionally damaging. So looking at what are the ways that we can prevent people like this from actually breaking down and ending up in depression and suicide. And so that's done in a number of ways. But the two, I don't want to get too into detail. I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So I really like the Q&A so much better. But is that they have these like two superpowers, is what I call them. And they're basically two additive traits that they have that, for one thing, separates them from a sociopath. And the other thing, it actually allows them to take the bold action that they do and then emerge from it still intact and living to fight another day. So one of them is ego resilience, which is an extremely strong sense of self, a strong sense of purpose. You can put yourself out there and you can have failure. You can someone can try to drag you down, but you keep standing up. It's like the video game character that gets knocked down and you're blinking, but you just keep standing up. You just keep going, and you have confidence that you will be able to keep going. And so you're able to take this bold action. Even if you suffer some consequences, your ego is still intact. And you have that extremely resilient personality naturally, just as an asset. And the other one is flexible detachment from emotions. And so basically that's when you're in a situation that takes a lot of courage, and most people will be scared of it. You can feel fear, but what you do is you just like set those emotions aside, like you're putting them on a shelf for momentarily, and that allows you to kind of go into situations that would otherwise be too emotionally, sensitive or terrifying, and then you're able to do what you're doing without worrying about, the emotions flooding that, prefrontal cortex, which allows you to like think on your feet and think logically and do, make good choices about things and not act on emotions. And so emotions get you to act in the first place, but then once you make a decision on how to act, then you kind of temporarily set that aside. You do what you need to do, and then afterwards you reattach, with your emotions or your empathy. And so that's really key, because what sociopaths do is they shove their emotions aside, and they do it permanently. Because it's easier for them to live the way that they do without having to worry about, shame, guilt, and the emotional fallout of doing, things that are wrong. An ex-altruist is able to do that situationally, but they don't do it permanently. And so the ability to go back and forth, flexibly detach from emotions and reattach is really an absolute, it really is a superpower. And fortunately, it can also be trained. and so can ego resilience. And so when you're looking at the bigger picture here, when you have people that have this tendency to act in bold, courageous ways, but they don't have the strength, or let's say they don't have the resilience, or they don't have, they're emotionally sensitive and they don't have the ability to just set it aside momentarily, these are actually things that can be trained and strengthened. And so that's like my ultimate goal is to, so now that I've identified what a lot of these things are, I'm looking at ways to train them so I can take preventative steps, even in childhood. So training these kinds of traits, training these things so that when they get to be adults, they're able to act in bold and courageous ways that as a society we really need, but still emerging from it intact and not completely destroyed, and living to fight another day. So that's just basically an overview, and I'll kind of leave it at that for right now. And if you want to go to, if someone wants to ask questions on anything, I'd like to do that right now.
Okay, good. Thank you, Andrea. So I had a question as we were watching the video. We just had a couple of folks talking about burnout and the emotional stress that comes from continually having to exercise our emotional resilience. They talked a little bit about some ways that they had used to get out of burnout, get out of the depression, get out of the stress. And I was wondering if you would give some...
Sorry, you cut out there.
So they gave some examples of how they had overcome the burnout. And I was hoping that you could, from a more clinical or more less anecdotal, more fact-based, broad scale, just share with us.
Evidence-based. Okay.
Yeah, just share with us some of the tips that you have for avoiding burnout or recovering from burnout.
Okay, so when you're talking about burnout, there's a lot of ways that can be interpreted. So are you talking about just being emotionally worn down from what you're doing, feeling, or lack of motivation? Or what exact angle are you talking about? Because
it's the extreme emotional fatigue, depression, frustration, kind of cloistering within yourself, bouts of anger, like those types of symptoms.
Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to say is that I think when I first had the conversation with Josh, can you hear? Okay, I think the first conversation that I had, we talked about this, and the fact that if you're this kind of a person, and to be personal, but this is actually, I am actually an ex-altruist, which is one of the reasons what drove me to study this in the first place, is because I was constantly getting myself into situations without even realizing it, because this is more of like a temperament. It's not like you really have a whole lot of control over your instincts, and so you instinctively act in these ways that you know you're doing the right thing, but then you end up suffering these consequences as a result, and it really sucks. You feel like the whole world's against you. You can't win. Like, what's the purpose? And after a while of doing this by yourself, ex-ultras kind of tend to be lone wolves because you're more effective that way. You start to get depressed, and it was distressing for me. But when I wrote my first piece and I first launched this out there, and I was a little bit terrified to do it because it was a brand new idea, and you're always worried about how people can accept this. I started getting emails from people all over the world, like not just from the United States, from other countries, telling me that it was like I was speaking right to them when I was talking about this personality type, and just how relieved they were, just even to know that there's someone else out there, that there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not crazy. I'm not damaged. Why do I keep doing these things that are self-damaging? I thought I was self-destructive. I thought I was self-injurious in emotional ways. But to know that there's other people out there that share this personality, and the fact that other people appreciate the fact that you're doing this, it just brought me so far out of my depression. It actually motivated me to keep going even stronger. So knowing that there's a community of people, even though you may not know each other immediately, because it's not like 20% of the people in the population are of this. It's probably maybe around 1%, I would say. But it's important that you seek out and at least get communicating with other people that are also like this. Because just knowing that there's a community, even if it's digital, that all support each other is really important. And then also, just not, as far as getting emotionally worn down and things like that, what I do, and actually I've been through this recently myself. This is actually personal. So a couple months ago, I was actually going through a hard time where I've given up jobs where I was making a lot more money. I've given up having things. I used to have this 3,000 square foot house, and I gave up everything and moved to San Francisco with like 4 suitcases because this is so important to me that this research needs to be continued. And it was difficult. And I find myself sometimes feeling like, what the hell's the point in all this? Because I feel like I'm making no headway. Here I am putting myself out there. It's, people are trying to discredit me. People are trying to stop me from what I'm doing. They're doing everything they can in their power to stand in your way. And yet you keep going, and there's not too many people encouraging you, but there's a lot of people discouraging you because it looks like you're this, pain in the ass troublemaker. But I reminded myself, it's like, what was the purpose? What's the bigger mission? So keeping in mind the purpose behind why you're doing what you're doing. And that's important to keep in mind anyway. So are you breaking these rules? Are you leaking government documents because fuck you government, I can do it? Or are you doing it because the people need to see this, and it's really important that the public has transparency and these things get out there, and if no one ever brings this forward, things will never change. So that's a bigger point, keeping that in mind. So if you're acting in ways because you're being reckless and things like that, that's probably not going to help you out in the long run. But keeping in mind the bigger mission, why you're doing it, and keep reminding yourself, what's the point? Why am I doing this? And actually, that will actually keep you grounded. It kind of keeps you motivated to think, there's a reason for all this. It's my, purpose for what I'm doing. And you may not see the results in the short term, but you'll see it in the long run. And reminding yourself of that actually helps. But seeking out individuals that are like you, that understand what you're struggling with, and not necessarily needing like group therapy or anything, but just knowing that other people understand and that they're there for you, really kind of goes a long way.
Yeah, good. Anybody else have questions? I'll repeat these for you, Andrea.
Okay. Yeah. So one good question that somebody just asked is whether or not you've studied information security professionals or IT professionals, and whether you find a higher prevalence of altruism in our fields than in the general populace. Okay, so I haven't studied that specifically as far as actually going in and doing inventories of people, but I am familiar with the community, and I have plenty of peers and friends that are in that community. And that wherever there's a high percentage